All right, so as you can tell, I'm at Matt's place, and this is take two. We recorded this earlier at Todd's place, but my microphone glitched out. We're talking about wavy things. Snake blades, undulating, wavy, however you want to call it. A lot of people wonder about these. It's hard to say with any certainty, but we have some speculation. And you have a few here that we can look at.
Yeah, so it just so happens, because I'm, as well as a YouTuber, I'm an antique dealer, I have some, the first ones we're going to see here are Filipino, Moro specifically, Moro Kris, or sometimes spelt Keris, but said Kris normally. So this is a really, really wavy blade one, which you can see there, and that's got a lot of undulations, and these are super sharp. These are definitely designed for use. We can see photographs from the period at the end of the 19th century when these were being used. This is probably a more typical example of a wavy bladed Kris, and you can see that the undulations are a little bit more gentle, but they're still definitely there.
Always the main speculation that this is a functional feature that makes them cut better. And you can absolutely make an argument. I've done some tests with Gambeson, and I found unless the blade is really sharp, it's not as easy to cut into it, whereas a recurve blade did much better, slicing into fabric armor. So I would guess that's probably happening here too. Rather than the entire edge being in contact with the target, you just have the peaks basically when the valleys are withdrawn.
There are also other types of Kris, the more pistol-gripped sort of dagger types, which are more thrusting weapons, and these are mostly chopping weapons. This example I've got here, not in such good condition, but it's an interesting one, and this is not uncommon type, where it's a wavy blade at the base, but then essentially the bit that you're mostly going to be hitting people with is essentially straight. So that would suggest that this wavy bit is really just for show. There aren't really many tools that have that, and you would think if it was greatly advantageous to just cutting, that we'd find some tools. Maybe there'd be some types of sickles or hedge cutting things, you know, bills that would have wavy blades on them. Not common, but they are found all over the world.
Yeah.
So we find them in Renaissance Europe, and there are Indian swords which do have these sort of undulating blades, and I think you've seen some in museums recently, haven't you?
With this one, you can definitely think about the potential for enhancing kind of slicing slashes. Basically, with a hewing, chopping action, you wouldn't get that so much. But as said, this one is straight on top, so that really sounds more like a stylistic thing. Maybe it could have religious meaning too.
It's very difficult to pull apart tradition and symbology from practicality, and yet they wanted wavy blades.
So this is something interesting to point out. This piece actually wraps around and secures the blade there. Yeah. I wasn't aware of that. I've seen that, but I thought it was just ornamental.
So no, this is actually really, really practical. So there is a tang which comes down here, which is essentially a rat tail tang, and these are friction fit on. They're basically hammered on, and then this rattan binding is put on to stop the wood from splitting. But before they put the binding on, there is this iron strap which has a little tang coming down here that is bound over. So it's like a safety measure to prevent the handle flying off in use, essentially. And some of them have two, as you can see on each side. Usually they just have one, but some have two on both sides. And sometimes these are connected, so this ring, this ferrule up here, are connected to these two bars or straps.
This one here is interesting. I saw a much more pronounced example of that at the Wallace collection. I've seen wavy rapier blades before. Flamberge type, basically undulating edges. But this is different. This is essentially a straight blade with an undulating grind. It has somewhat of a similar effect. You can see it has peaks and valleys as well, just in a different way. So essentially, instead of having peaks and valleys in the profile of the blade, it has that in the thickness. Also an absolutely gorgeous hilt. Just how even it is, that it will be quite challenging to grind it so evenly. I don't see any deviations really. The spacing is quite even. In fact, if you handed me a reproduction that's made exactly like this, or if you claimed it was a reproduction, I would believe you. If you said it was machine made, I would not doubt that. That is definitely one of the most interesting pieces I've seen. It's not actually wavy in terms of profile as such. Like the profile is what you would expect from a tulwar blade, but there is a wavy grind on top there.
So I'd almost call it corrugated. It's almost like corrugated steel roof. I have some theories about that, and it does seem that looking at Indian weapons, they're sometimes serrated with teeth, they're sometimes a wavy blade, and they're sometimes corrugated like this. And there seems to be a correlation between these exotic edges and hunting. Now, looking into the written texts in the 19th century, it seems that sometimes these weapons were used as specifically as hunting swords. So they would use a bow or a firearm as a primary weapon, but if they were out hunting tigers, often the first shot wouldn't stop the tiger or the bear, and so it would charge at them, and at that point they used their sword or their kukri. Maybe they increase bleeding out, or maybe they increase the deterrence through pain. So there's been some things I've read which suggest that the wounds they cause might not be as serious, but they might be more painful.
The pain factor seems pretty plausible to me, just looking at that, just because normally the edge is straight. Like if you look at it, straight on, it's just a line, whereas this is like the edge itself is a wavy line, not the profile. So I would imagine that might cause some raggedy wounds that are very unpleasant and may not heal as well.
So I think there's a lot of different things going on. There's symbolism, there's religion, sometimes certain medical beliefs, which we now know to be wrong. They could be widely held within an area, and that could explain some of the designs of some of these weapons because they think it makes it more effective. We've also got the complicated factor that in some of Southeast Asia, they used poisons, and there were also relationships with reptiles and things like venomous snakes and things like that. So some of this could be trying to make the weapon look like a serpent, a bit like the mention of the snake in the steel in Viking era swords. To some points we even know that this was specifically put into Viking era swords, so that the idea that if your sword is more like a serpent it will somehow be more lethal. We don't know. There's many possible explanations. But then European flamberge blades, that must be a completely different kettle of fish.
You would think so, yeah, because it's a completely different area. They have different cultural background, different beliefs, different armor and everything. And in that case, I think it seems plausible. For one, either it could just be intimidation. Even if you know that, okay, being cut with this compared to being cut with a properly sharp straight blade, it may not make that much of a difference.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously
I'd rather be cut with this than with that, right? Because this will lop your limbs straight off.
But this is obviously a straight blade, but there were lots of these big two-handers, Zweihander, if you want to call them that, Montante, that had wavy blades. Yeah. So the question is, and we do find other European swords with wavy blades sometimes. We sometimes find basket-held broadswords, sometimes even rapiers have them.
Even small swords, I saw a couple with wavy blades.
Yeah, and you kind of think with those, it might be a question of showing off, of saying, look, I've spent 3 times as much money on this wavy blade because it looks amazing. But with the two-handed swords, you get the feeling that there must be some functional... They're actually quite common on two-handed swords, so there must be some functional benefit. And the only thing that I can really think of is this idea that these are for going against pikes. Is there a binding advantage? And I actually personally think that is the most likely explanation, because when we've had wavy blades made for HEMA practice purposes, they definitely bind more. Because, a straight blade, another blade will slide straight down it, but a wavy blade, it doesn't happen. So if you're trying to bind against pikes or bills or halberds, then maybe a wavy blade assists in doing that.
Oh, yeah. It might bind the hafts better. With a rapier with a wavy blade, you might get a stronger bind, perhaps, if you constrain the opponent's blade. This one that I mentioned to you earlier at the Royal Armouries, there's a very interesting one. It's not quite serrated, but it has like additional knobs, I can only call them. It almost looks like something in between wavy and serrated. That would definitely help with binding. Would make sense, but was that the idea? So often they make things just because, well, they're cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
And especially nobles, they like to show off. And sometimes things were made just because they were harder to make. Like so many combination weapons, like they're somewhat functional, but you're better off with a solid one.
And I think that could also be, even with these big two-handers, that could also be an explanation there, because they are show-off weapons. They were carried by bodyguards. They were carried in processions. You know, I've equipped my bodyguard. You've got to see the new swords they've got, and then they come out and everyone's like, whoa. And it's a way of showing off that you've spent, you know, 3 times as much money on your bodyguard's equipment as your pal from the other city.
Clearly, whatever functional advantage there might be wasn't enough to make them think, you know what, let's make all of these like that.
Yeah. And you know, there's also the question of maintaining and sharpening these. And we spoke a bit to Todd about this.
They are not as hard to make as you'd think. So basically you make it as a straight blade and then you bevel it as a straight blade, just as if it is finished. And then what you do is you dive in and you remove those parts there, and then you have to go in and redress that edge individually bit by bit. It's not difficult to do. I think it would be difficult to get a beautifully, perfectly flat one. And actually you can see that there's a little bit of wobble on the edges there. It's not a continuous, smooth flowing curve. I can see this being very useful for effectively cutting a hard skin. So for instance, thin armour of some kind, fabric armour or I don't know, woven grass armour or whatever it might be. Or indeed your skin, which can actually be a little bit tough as well. So once it's actually broken through the slightly tougher outer layer, it won't make any difference at all. That would be my guess. It's like a bread knife, isn't it? Going in or coming out, it's going to cut a lot easier. Yeah. But that's because it's concentrating the force as well. I think it's a bit like when you're saw cutting with a wood saw. You don't keep going straight. You're always rocking your cut.
Even if they're not that tricky to make, just sharpening. I mean, I don't think I would have fun with that. Also, you have to be much more careful with it.
They are horrible to handle because, you know, this is the blunt, obviously, but with a straight edge, when you hold it, your flesh is spread out over a broad area and it feels more secure. As soon as you grab one of these, you can feel those undulations digging in, and it's just horrible.
These are basically anti-half sorting designs. And in fact, that could also be something, because in some of the manuscripts you see techniques shown where you just hold on to the opponent's blade, even if just for a moment, like just get it out of the way or pull on it. And also the counter to it, I don't remember which it was, but there was also the response to that. If someone grabs your blade, you twist it and pull it. Imagine that with this. So I think these would be pretty much impossible to grab safely. They would absolutely slice up your hand, shred it pretty much.
When you're using one of these swords, one of the dangers is someone closing in on you, because obviously this thing is great at range because it's got tons and tons of range. But if someone manages to either avoid your blow or stop your blow, if they've got something large enough to do that, and then charge in, these aren't particularly good up close. Okay, you've got a crossguard and a pommel to hit with, but if they can grab your blade, your weapon's basically immobilized. Well, if you've got a wavy blade, it's harder for them to do that.
I would imagine mail probably renders this entirely ineffective, because they are not very heavy. This one in particular is very light. So you could take a hit on mail and it wouldn't break bones or...
And probably damage the edge of this.
Exactly. And thrusting into the mail is also not going to happen with this. When it comes to the two-handed swords, they would, of course, encounter armor.
Indian, similar to 16th century Europe, actually, in that there were a fair number of armoured people, particularly with mail and bits of plate helmets, and sometimes breastplates or cuirasses. But again, which soldiers are we talking about? Are we talking about the really well-equipped, you know, the equivalent of knights who would have had armour in India? But the mass soldiers, most of them would have had very little armour. Similar to 16th century Europe, because there would have been a lot of soldiers who would have had partial armour. So obviously hitting them in the arms or legs, still very, very effective.
So yeah, we don't have a definite answer. I don't think anybody has. But those are some speculations. Could be practical, could be ceremonial. That's the naughty word again. In some cases,
ritual.
Ritual. Yeah, it could be prestige. It could be a number of things. In different areas, at different time periods, might be different. It could sometimes be all three, pretty much. You never know. So anyway, hope you found it interesting. Thanks for joining me in that, Matt. And of course, thanks for having us over. Very much appreciated. And hope you had fun too. Take care.